We are going to read the word. We'll read from the book of Daniel, chapter 3. Daniel, chapter 3. And we all know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and how they were thrown into the fiery furnace. So I'll start from verse 8. Because we all know, they were told that when you hear the sound of the instrument, you ought, everyone in that land, they ought to bow down and worship God. But we also know what happened to what they did and what happened to them. So we are going to read from verse 8. I'll read all the way to the end. I'm reading from NIV. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hands. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out here. Come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." They trusted in him and defied the king's order and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. We may have our seats. Yes, like I mentioned, we all know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And my topic of today is standing firm for Christ regardless, because the end game is always the same, that God may take the glory. And these three men stood firm for Christ regardless. Their lives were threatened. Their lives were actually at stake, but they chose to stand firm for Christ. And sometimes we find ourselves in places where our faith is tested. And most often than not, you find, like Peter, we fall into that temptation and deny Christ. But we see in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were like, even if it will cost us our lives, we cannot worship any other God apart from the God that we know. And you'll find that sometimes the enemy, even as you're standing firm in your faith, the enemy will still try to tempt you and test you. With Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even after they were brought before the king, we see the king giving them another chance. When they were just standing in front of him, the king tells them that we are going to blow these instruments and we are giving you another chance. If you bow now, then we'll let you go. But if you don't, your predicament is what? The fiery furnace. And these guys still said, and they told, and I actually like the confidence. Imagine going before the president, and he tells you to do something, and he asks you, I am giving you one last chance. If you don't do it, then we assassinate you here and here. Hakuna story ingine. So trying to put yourself in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's shoes, would you still stand firm for Christ, even when you're in front of the king, even when you're brought before the king? So these three men, actually in verse 16, it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it all. They had faith in God. They knew this God that we serve is a true God, and he's able to get us out of this situation. And they carry on to say, yes, we know that the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hands. But if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So yes, they believed in God, and they had faith, and they knew God is able to deliver us from this situation that we are in. And they went ahead and said, even if God does not come through, there is no way we are going to disobey our God. There is no way we are going to worship any other God. And they stood firm for Christ, even in their difficult situation. And we see sometimes, or rather most of the times, when the Lord allows such things to happen, it is for him to take the glory in the end. At the end, we see God taking the glory. When this chapter ends, we see God taking the glory, where the king actually says that everyone on that land no one was to talk against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And sometimes you find the Lord allows you to go through that situation. The Lord allows you to go through that difficulty because he knows the end game. If these men were not thrown in the fire, then no one would have ever known of the magnitude of the saving power of God. They would not have had an idea of how mighty the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is. So sometimes you find yourself going through that storm, walking through that difficult season in your life, and you're wondering and you're asking God, God, have you forgotten me? Why are you allowing me to go through this painful season? And God is able to, cut short the pain. God is able to get you out of that season. But he allows you to go through it all, that he may get the glory. And sometimes it's also for you. Probably he's working in you. He's molding you. So he wants you to go through that whole process so that you come out to be a better person. And we all know, I can give an example of a chef. When a chef is preparing food in the kitchen, when he's preparing meat, basically, to be specific, when he puts that piece of meat when it's raw in fire, a lot of things, there's a lot of changes that take place in that meat. First of all, we have the change in color. It's usually red. For example, if we are looking at red meat, it's usually red. But we start seeing it slowly and slowly turning its color while it's in the heat. After that, it starts becoming tender and softer. And if the meat were to talk, it would have told the chef, "Ay, by the way, this heat is too much. Please, nitoe sahi." But the chef doesn't do that. The chef continues cooking this meat until it is ready, is when he gets it out of the fire and serves it, a complete meal. And that is what the Lord does with us in our lives. When he's working in us, he has to take us through that fire. He has to take you through that season, and he cannot get you out of it before the appropriate time, before the opportune time. He will let you go through it. And most often than not, that season is always painful. It's never an easy season. But our God, who is loving and who wants the best for us, allows us to go through that path because he knows the end game. He knows in the end you're going to come out better. You're going to come out beautiful, that he may use you. And the same happens to gold. When gold is being purified, it goes through intense heat. And without that heat, it cannot come out to be that expensive product that we see in the end. So when you're going through that phase, the only thing you can do is ask God for his grace to be sufficient through that season. Because in the end, you're the one to benefit. When we look at Job went through it all. Yeah? And what he didn't know is that God actually allowed the enemy to bring calamity to him. And the enemy actually did. We see when God was asking the enemy, "Have you seen any man on earth who fears me like the way my servant Job does?" And the enemy, remember, accuser of men, he goes ahead and tells God, the only reason Job fears you is because you have blessed him. So he tells God, you try and get your hand off him and see if he will still fear you. He actually tells God, he will curse you on your face. So wherever Job was, if he gave up on God, if he cursed God, imagine the enemy is the one who would have won the argument. But he didn't. Even his wife tried to talk him into cursing God, but he didn't. And the beauty about it is God allowed the enemy to go and do all these things to Job because he knew there is no way Job would denounce him. God knew. And that is why he allowed the enemy to do all these things. Remember, the heart of man has an audience of one. God had searched Job's heart, and he knew very well, this man fears me, and fears me for real. It's not lip service. He fears me for real. And this guy cannot denounce me. So he allowed the enemy to go and bring calamity to him. But in the end, we see God taking the glory. And even us today, as we read the book of Job, we just see the mighty works of God. We just see how powerful and how mighty our God is. So what am I saying? Stand firm. In the midst of trials, stand firm and stand for Christ. Do not fall into temptation. Do not get tempted into giving up. And because most of the times you'll find that's the time the enemy actually takes advantage. He would try and bring thoughts to your mind of, oh, God does not care about you, or does it really matter? Why are you going through this suffering? Because his battle is in the mind. That's where he actually wins his battle, with the mind of man. So when you're going through that season, stand firm. Just know that all things are working together for your good. Yeah? Romans 8:28 tells us that for we know that all things work together for good. And it's not for everyone, it is for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. So when you're going through that difficult moment, ask yourself, do I love the Lord? I love the Lord. Then it is for good. Let me allow the Lord to do his work. Because in the end, one, God is going to take his glory. And two, you're going to get out a better person. I want us to also look at the book of Daniel 6. Daniel, we all know the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And actually, let's just read what happens there. Daniel chapter 6, from verse 10 thereabout. It says, when Daniel, I'm reading from NIV, When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the orders, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angels, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. You see, in this story, we are told that the king tried to save Daniel because he had the kingship authority to do that. He had the authority to say, this is a different situation, we shall save him. But he didn't. And the Lord actually made it so that the king does not save him, because but if we came to read this story, or if anyone heard of this story, they'd be like, it's the king who saved him. If it were not for the king, he would have been, eaten by the lions. But God made it so that the king was not the one who was going to save Daniel. Why? Because God had to take the glory in all this. He had to be put in the lion's den, and the lions did not touch him or harm him, so that people can know for sure this was God. There was no any other option. There was no any other excuse. This was God and only God. So my encouragement today is stand firm for Christ. Whenever you find yourself in trials, in tribulations, stand firm and trust. Because the word also reminds us that blessed is that person who puts their trust in the Lord. He can never put anyone who puts their trust in him to shame. There is no way. And because God knows that he has to uphold his integrity, he will surely come for you. And he has to take the glory in your life. Amen?